So would like to thank everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. Not that you had a choice if you're taking my class. So my name's Dr. Alvaro Huerta. I'm an assistant professor in urban and regional planning and ethnic and women's studies. And today we have an excellent speaker, Dr. Alex Shafran. And he'll be giving a book talk on his recent book by the University of California Press. It's a really prestigious press. They never publish me. I guess they have a quota for Mexicans. I think they publish one Mexican every 50 years, so I have to wait another 50 years to get published. Maybe my son will publish, but maybe because I know Dr. Shafran, he can help me out. But he talks about resegregation, and I'll have him give more specifics about the book and the title and things of that nature. For me, with Dr. Shafran in particular, it's not just an academic relationship, it's more personal. So we go way back. We're homies. We go back to the hood. So I met Dr. Shafran in 2006. Both of us were PhD students at the University of California, Berkeley, at the Department of Regional, Department of City and Regional Planning. That's what happens when you get a PhD, you forget about things. The Department of City and Regional Planning, I should know this because I'm still paying for the tuition of the PhD. I have overdraft protection, so I'm not worried about it. The 28th is due. So that's where we first met. And we have a lot in common, actually. We're both social activists. We have that activist background. We both went to Berkeley, a DCRP, trained by the leading planning theorists in the world, like Dr. Judy Enos. And also, and most important, we're published authors, but most important, and I think this was what really counts, is we're both good looking. And this is why we're successful. I know it's not fair. It's not fair. That's how we get published. We don't even send a manuscript. We just send a photo, It's like, sure, whatever you want, like sign on the dotted line, Dr. Huerta and Dr. Shafran. It's an old joke that I used with another professor. So I think what's important here, and I think why Dr. Shafran is really important in terms of being an academic, and he teaches at Leeds University, is that he believes in a lot of what Cal Poly Pomona students believe. He believes in questions of diversity. He believes in questions of social justice. For him, it's not research for research's sake. It's for research to make a difference. And I think that's what makes a place like Cal Poly Pomona a great university. And that's why we have the honor of having a great academic, speak to us about an important issue about segregation and resegregation when it comes to housing, when it comes to neighborhoods. So that said, without further ado, Dr. Shafran.
That's definitely the best intro I've had on the strip by far. I think you forgot to mention it wasn't that we were homies. We were back in the day when people were collecting homies. It's great to be here. It's good to be back in Cali. I am not English, if you haven't figured that out, from the northern part of California. I do say toilets, though, now, and a few other things like that, so people think I'm English. Yeah, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I'm excited to be in Pomona for the first time. I'm really excited to try to explain a little bit about this book and about where it comes from and about what it's trying to do. If you have any questions, we don't have a chance to chat today, or you don't get your questions answered, please, send me an email. I'm happy to talk. You can find me, at my website, et cetera, whatever, or just through University of Leeds. If for whatever reason you want to buy the book, there's a discount on the website. So it's still more expensive than it should be, but it's less expensive than the cover price. And also, one of the things I'm not going to talk a ton about today is, or at least in the lecture part, are kind of some of the big crazy solutions to the problem. But the conclusion has that, and the conclusion is on my website for free. You can download the PDF, and that has kind of a vision for the future of California. And if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to come back to Pomona anytime. In fact, you can hire me, and I'll come back here, and you'll see me so often. I'll even live in those new student dorms that you're building right there. That's fine. Great. Because obviously you can't find parking. And I really appreciate that I got the fancy parking spot in front of some of you guys gave me the fancy parking spot in front of the new spaceship building out front, right there. I really appreciate that. So this is a book that born and raised in California and have watched the state transform in all kinds of crazy ways over the last 40 years. And this book is an attempt in some ways to understand how and why the San Francisco Bay Area, Northern California in particular, changed in the way that it changed. We're definitely the richest region in the United States, one of the richest regions in the world. You can make an argument that we're one of the richest regions in the history of the world. We're also supposedly the most progressive, right? We love our politics. We think we're awesome. We're super, we're in the forefront of everything that's supposed to be good, from like gay rights to Cesar Chavez from San Jose, to the Black Panthers, to environmentalism. Like supposedly the Bay Area is on the forefront of everything right. But yet somehow over the last 40 years, we have resegregated. It's an extremely unjust place. It's an extremely unequal place. It's an extremely environmentally unsustainable place. It's a place where inequality is growing. It's a place where racism continues. So how did this happen? Why did this happen? What is going on? So what I'm going to do today is, so that's what this book about. The book in some ways is a little bit about my journey, trying to figure out, did a PhD at Berkeley with Alvaro, trying to figure out in some ways what's happening, what's going on. So what I'm going to try to do today is sort of in two parts. The first part is I want to explain a little bit about why I call what's happened in the Bay Area, and I would use the same term for Southern California, resegregation. I'm explaining a little bit about what I mean by resegregation, and then I'm actually going to take questions at that point as well, because I want to make sure that we're on the same page, or whether we're on the same page or not, that you understand where I'm coming from, and that you have a chance to ask questions about what I mean and why I call it that, and why I think it's important to talk about what happened in the Bay Area in terms of resegregation. And again, I'll do my best to try to situate it a little bit in Southern California, but I think, again, those of you who know San Bernardino and Fontana or Palmdale or Lancaster will know a little bit about what I'm talking about. Then I'll talk a little bit about why it happened. Right? How, again, we're supposed to be so awesome. We are convinced that we are awesome. The Bay Area is certainly beautiful. There are certainly a lot of really amazing and smart people. Our basketball team is certainly much better than your basketball teams right now, and that's wonderful. But that won't last, tragically. Enjoy it while it lasts. All right? And that'll be the second part of it, and then I'll take Q&A at the end of that. And then if you want, again, in that Q&A part, we can talk a little bit about, again, future solutions. What does it mean? How do we get beyond where we're at? So let me start with this sort of question of resegregation as a fact. So this is a map, and I hope you can see it. I'll do my best, and I hope the cameras will catch me if I come in here. This is a dot density map of race in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1970. And so the most important thing I want you to pay attention to are the yellow dots. That's a representative of the African-American population. And you can see folks are, for the most part, yep. Oh, there you go. Perfect. For the most part, in a handful of neighborhoods, right? So that's the southeastern corner of San Francisco, the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood. That's East Oakland and West Oakland. That's the city of Richmond. He's East Palo Alto. For those of you, anybody who knows the Bay, that's sort of the only place you can see in a pretty broad stretch. This is Silicon Valley, where all your computers come from, right? But again, you can see huge swaths of green. Now, the Latino population is represented in red is a little bit more integrated, to use that term, right? Some of that has to do with sort of who was counted as a Latino in 1970, right? But for the most part, this is sort of how segregation operated in that period of time. If you were African American in particular, you were trapped. You were confined, right? Segregation was about basically keeping people of color in a handful of places that were right up against all the heavy, dirty industry. Hunters Point was one of the most polluted places on the entire West Coast. keeping people trapped in particular areas, right? In the meantime, white folks sort of went out and suburbanized in huge numbers, right? So this is, again, this is 1970. So we've had 20, 30 years of that post-war suburbanization, highways built by the federal government, suburbs in mass numbers. Again, primarily for white folks, right? This is where I grew up in Marin County. You don't see a whole lot of yellow or red dots anywhere, right? And this is how segregation operated in a lot of places. And I'm assuming some of you know a little bit about the history of segregation. I won't go too deeply into how it happened or why it happened. Some of you may have read The Color of Law, the recent book by Richard Rothstein about it. And now it's great. I mean, one of the things that's nice about the current moment in some ways is that people are talking about segregation in that old school way. You're hearing people talk about redlining, right? That practice that produced a lot of disinvestment in these neighborhoods where communities of color had to live. We know a little bit about, again, some of the various ways in which white suburbs were made exclusive. Now, there's, again, one of the things, don't get too deep, I don't want to get too, some of the sort of story of the inner city and the suburbs is a little overblown because, for instance, there were always parts of suburban areas that were more diverse, right? If you go to some of the suburbs in South LA, for instance, right, some of the suburbs in the south side of Chicago. So we're always more diverse. So it's not always about city versus suburbs. Some of the suburbs were part of this geography of segregation. But in general, post-war segregation was about confining people of color to a very small set of areas that tended to be more inner city and heavily disinvested, where opportunity was less, and white folks got to move with their federally guaranteed mortgages and the highways that were built by the federal government out to these cities, right, which then had good fiscal infrastructure, so the schools were good, parks were nice, et cetera, et cetera. So that created the post-war America, and again, it's different in different places. The Bay Area is a super kind of complex place that doesn't have just one city, right? We got 3 main cities. LA is a bit of a weird place too, or the Southern California, but you can find some variation of this post-war segregation in almost every city in the United States. This was the story. Right? To be segregated, especially for African American in the post-war era, was to be trapped and confined in a certain number of places. And so what this has done is, in many ways, has created what I think of as like a mental map of what segregation is. When we think about the word segregation, we think to be segregated, it means kind of keeping certain people in certain places and everybody else gets to do whatever they want. So this is a map. These are composite mental maps. It was an exercise that was done. This is a 1971 City of Los Angeles plan. I'm happy to send you the original document if you want. And what they did in this is they surveyed white folks from the San Fernando Valley and Latinos from East LA about what was their Los Angeles? What was their city? What were the spaces where they went, where they felt comfortable, where they felt, where there was opportunity, where people lived? What was your Los Angeles? This is 1971. So on the left side, you can see this is a composite map. So they did this exercise based on the work of Kevin Lynch, if anybody knows their landscape, architecture history, urban design. So the left side is the valley. And though, we're in Southern California, y'all know. So here's the valley. Right, here's the beach in Santa Monica, here's downtown LA. So it's basically like, the whole west side is your oyster. I mean, after all, the highways were built for you. They all work really well at that time. This is before the traffic got terrible. It was a big region, it was a big city. This is a composite mental map of people living in East LA at the time, right? Trapped, focused. There was not a lot of space, right? LAPD kind of various other forces keeping you confined. And so again, this is how I like to think of, is how we understand segregation, because this is what segregation was all about. Segregation is still this way in a lot of places, right? So I'll go back to here. One of the challenges of understanding it is that in some ways, parts of East Oakland, parts of West Oakland, parts of Richmond, especially like North Richmond, are still very much like this for a lot of people. It's still that act of in some ways being confined and being trapped. Many of these places are still really disinvested, underinvested, right? Still don't have a ton of opportunity, don't have great access to transit or clean air or fresh food or you name it. But something has changed. So this is a little chart that'll show you the African-American population in the city of San Francisco, the city and county of San Francisco, that's the red line. And the black line is San Joaquin County. So those who don't know your NorCal geography, this is San Joaquin County. It's a really big-ass county out in the Central Valley, you know, farm territory. When I was growing up, this was not the Bay at all. Stockton is one of the 100 largest cities in the United States. It's a place on its own. It's got its own history and its own culture. It was connected to San Francisco via, you know, various formed economic relations from the time of the gold rush. It's a major port for the export of a lot of Central Valley farm goods, but it's very much its own place. So this is San Joaquin County, and there's San Francisco County, just 49 square miles on the tip of that peninsula. So this is the African-American population in the two counties starting in 1970. So basically what happened is that over the period of my and Alvaro's lifetime, he's older and better looking than I am, but not by much. You're a lot better looking, but not that much older. Yeah, exactly. So basically you have a situation where communities of color, right, migrated, suburbanized during a long period of time, over a 2-3 decade period of time. And we're not just talking about African Americans, but we're talking about, you know, Filipinos from Daly City. We're talking about Cambodian, Vietnamese refugees immigrants who had originally settled in parts of East Oakland. We're talking about the big Latino population in East San Jose. We're talking about lots of different folks. We're also talking about working class whites in the same period of time. As the Bay Area grew, as the Bay Area got more expensive, as the Bay Area gentrified, as Silicon Valley became a thing, as everybody now has a computer, well, at least that's Adele, that's from Texas. But for the most part, when I give this lecture, I look out and I just see our stuff. As this happened, people move for different reasons. Some people move because they want to buy a house and they can't afford it in the core. Some people move for better opportunities for their kids because the education is better. Some people move to get away from violence of different kinds or from bad air. Some people just move for quiet. Some people move because their cousin moved or their mom moved or their aunt moved, or there are all kinds of reasons why people move. I'm not a sociologist or an anthropologist. This book is not about why people moved. It's about what happens when they did. What are the structural inequalities that are incorporated into this move? So over a 30, 40-year period of time, people moved east. They didn't move to the bougie, increasingly white suburbs up here. They didn't move to Walnut Creek or the really nice, fancy, expensive suburbs here that have a ton of jobs and federally funded freeways that run through. They moved to San Joaquin County. They moved to eastern Contra Costa County. They moved to southern Solano County. They moved to deep in Modesto. Modesto to San Jose, 2.5 hours each way with traffic. So they moved. Right? It wasn't like, you know, this map is not this map anymore. They moved deep and they moved far. And so the active communities of color moving to the suburbs is not resegregation. I mean, it's just like people moving to the suburbs. One of the problems with the study of how segregation is that, like, somehow folks sometimes think that it's somehow unusual or weird or inherently worth thinking about or talking about when people move to suburbia. But it's like, this is America. This is what people do. You know, it's like white folks have been doing it for a long time. Suburbia can be nice. It's not my cup of tea necessarily, but people like it. You know, people want a house. It's the American dream. The problem is that the suburbia that this majority non-white wave of suburbanization moved to is structurally unequal vis-a-vis the suburbia that I grew up in. Right? Everybody's moving to the suburbs, not the same suburbs, not with the same level of opportunity, right? Not with the same level of stability. So this is a map that you can see of foreclosure rates in 2008, right? I hope most of you are old enough to remember the crisis. It's terrifying that it's like 10. I mean, to me, it feels like yesterday, but yeah, some of you guys were, yeah, right? So again, you have this massive wave of people of color moving. Now you have cities like Antioch, California, which I spent a lot of time studying, that went from about 25,000 people to about 100,000 people. Brentwood went from about 2,500 people to about 75,000 people. Patterson was a little town right here. 2,000 people to about 25,000 people in 20 years. Fast growing, big places. Almost all of these places out here are now majority non-white. Where did the foreclosures happen? Right there. The suburbs that people move to, Southern Solano County, Eastern Solano County, so these are now majority non-white cities with far and away the highest foreclosure rates in the region. This is some of the worst foreclosure. This is the heart of the crisis, right? Again, San Francisco Bay Area, one of the richest metropolises in the history of the world. We were right front and center on the top of every list of like the epicenters of the foreclosure crisis, along with Inland Empire and places in Vegas and places in Arizona and places in Florida and a couple of places in Michigan and Ohio. Us, right? Right in the heart of it, right in the beast, right? And again, not here. Stockton, California, the foreclosure rate at this time was like somewhere around 2,500 foreclosures for every 100,000 people. In San Francisco, it was 72, right? 2,500 in Stockton, 72 in San Francisco. Patterson was about 5,000 foreclosures for every 100,000 people. Palo Alto, home of Stanford University, 5 foreclosures. So this little town out here had a foreclosure rate 1,000 times higher than Palo Alto, which is a classic post-war American suburb where, you know, 2 federally funded freeways run right through you, where almost all the houses were bought with federally guaranteed mortgages, and nobody got foreclosed. And guess what? The public schools are some of the best in the country. Right? Nobody could afford to buy that house there because, again, when Palo Alto was built, it was built as a place for white folks. So this is, to me, again, we now have a new map of race and class. The Bay Area doesn't look like this anymore. There's a new map of race and class where communities of color are spread much deeper and farther out, but where the majority of majority non-white places are out in here. And this is where the foreclosures were bad, right? Because of the foreclosures, what happens when you have foreclosures, right? Property values plummeted. This created a massive fiscal crisis. What are the 2 largest municipal bankruptcies in the history of the United States of America? Vallejo, California, and Stockton, California. Right? With fiscal crises comes less money for schools, less money for roads, less money for parks, less money for swimming pools, less money for all of the things that make suburban life worth living. Right? You have increasing rates of poverty in a lot of these places and a social service infrastructure that is not necessarily prepared to deal with it. So again, you have a new map of race and class in the region. It doesn't look like the old map, but it's still structurally unequal along lines of race. And to me, when you see structural inequality on a big map divided by race, you got to call it segregation. To me, that's what it is, right? You got to use the S word. And this is complicated, though, because, again, it's not the same kind of segregation that we had in the post-war era. It's not exclusively about being trapped in places with less opportunity, right? If you're African American or Latino or you can move wherever you want, but not really. Right? Yeah, theoretically. And if you're rich, you can. Right? So one of the most famous moments in the history of segregation in San Francisco occurred in 1958 when Willie Mays and the San Francisco Giants arrived. Right? You know, the team that wins the World Series. You've heard of the Giants, right? Sorry. Can't help it. It's just, I don't get to Southern California very often, and I know I'm not going to get invited back now. So there was a famous moment that was very important in my family history because my grandfather would always tell the story how angry he was. Right? Willie Mays tried to buy a house in a very exclusive neighborhood in San Francisco, and they wouldn't let him. This is the most famous baseball player in the world. One of the most famous athletes in the country, without a doubt, couldn't buy a house. Steph Curry can buy a house anywhere he wants. That aspect of segregation has changed. But the majority of African Americans who grew up in Oakland, et cetera, who have migrated to various places, don't obviously have the same opportunity. So yeah, class has become a part of the story in a way that perhaps it wasn't. But it doesn't mean that this is just something now it's about class and it's not about race. Right? The number, again, when you see these majority non-white spaces suffering in a way that majority white spaces are not suffering, in my opinion, you have to call it segregation. So let me just give you a couple of ways of thinking about it, just to be a little clear, and then I'll take some questions to see if anybody has any understanding. So one of the things that I do that's really important is try to sort of think about segregation in two ways. So one of the easier ways probably to think about it than resegregation is to talk about like segregation 2.0 or the new segregation. Now I don't call it segregation 2.0 because I'm not a Silicon Valley guy and I don't like 2.0 talk or 3.0 talk and I don't want to sound like I do. So one of the things I talk about is essentially two types of segregation. What I call ghettoized segregation, which is that post-war segregation where it was about being trapped, right? Versus this kind of more mobile segregation, which is like, you know, your house got foreclosed on and so you got to rent a new house down the street, right? And you might move from that suburb to a different suburb, right? And again, constantly moving around. Yeah, you can move around the metropolis, but only to certain parts of the metropolis and only the parts generally far away, right? So again, if being in an old school segregated metropolis meant that they built a federally funded highway through your neighborhood and divided your neighborhood and you had to live right up against the pollution, but you couldn't afford to own a car and you were trapped in this space, the new form of segregation means you spend way too much time on that highway because you drive 90 minutes each way from your far-ass house out in the deep, 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 deep suburb that saw a lot of foreclosures and that's struggling to keep the schools in good condition versus folks living in a much closer inner ring suburb where all the highways are already paid for and that house is already paid for. And you're sitting on a ton of money and your biggest problem is figuring out how to like get it to your kids without paying inheritance tax. All right? So again, two different eras of segregation, two different types of segregation, right? So that's in some ways what I mean, right? So yeah, again, the book should probably be called The Road to New Forms of Segregation or Segregation 2.0, but I don't want to sound like a bigger arsehole than I am. Let me make a couple, again, other points about this, and then I'll take some questions about this, and then I'll talk about how this happened. So again, it's really segregation 2.0. It's a new kind of segregation. It's not your grandparents' segregation, but again, still think you need to call it that. And it's got this difference between being trapped in a handful of confined spaces versus moving around too often and too far. Right? Again, if you look at the highest rates of mega commutes, like who is getting in their car and driving 90 minutes each way in the morning, 2 hours each way in the morning, that act is racialized in Southern California and in Northern California. So one important thing is that we often make this like old school, like 20th century mistake of thinking that like one thing comes along and it replaces the other thing, but that's just not how this works. So both kinds of segregation continue to exist, right? In many ways, certain parts of old neighborhoods that were part of post-war segregation are still racialized in that particular way, even as they gentrify, right? Just because East Oakland or West Oakland, right, is gentrifying doesn't mean the schools are better. Doesn't mean the opportunity for people of color is better there. Doesn't mean that if you're young and African American and male walking down the street that you're any less at risk of being involved in violence or being a victim of violence. It hasn't gotten better. So it's important to understand that these two types of segregations coexist and in some ways feed off each other. Because again, that opportunity continues to be problematic for a lot of people in some of the older neighborhoods. That's what pushes people to move out to newer spaces, but they can't move out to the spaces right next door, so they got to go one more and one more and one more, and right? And then if you're talking about the Bay Area, we're talking about places that are way off the public transportation line. We're talking about places that don't even have federally funded freeways. A lot of these cities had to build their own highways to get people out there. It's also important that I'm not implying by calling it resegregation that we went from segregation to desegregation and now we're going backwards. I definitely imply that one of the reasons why I like calling it resegregation is that implication of going backwards is important. It's important for us to think historically like, maybe things aren't all getting better in this one way, but right, this recognition that there's back and forth. But I don't imply in any way. Now there may, again, I'm not saying there hasn't been certain forms of desegregation, but don't assume that I'm implying that. Again, because it's mostly kind of a new form. And the other thing to think about, and this is really, really important, is that we have a tendency to think of segregation and integration as opposites. Either a place is segregated or it's integrated. That's the mistake. So a lot of the places that I do work in, like Antioch, California, or Vallejo, or Stockton, or Palmdale, or Lancaster, right, or San Bernardino and Fontana, et cetera, are integrated inside. Like you go there and it's like everybody is there. Or not everybody. There's a certain groups of folks that are conspicuously not there. But for the most part, most of the world seems to be there. So on a local level, they're super integrated. But when you look at it on a regional scale, and you look at race and class spread out over a big map, in fact, they're not. The region is not fully integrated, and opportunity is not equal everywhere. And this is one of the hardest things. And this is one of the things that, again, I'm trying to get folks to think about, is that for too long, the focus of policy and politics around race and segregation has been about, is America still segregated? And the sociologists, I don't know if anybody's a sociologist, like kind of apologies if you feel insulted, or not really, I mean, come on. I love you sociologists. Sociology's awesome, right? We come up with these like segregation, these different indices of segregation, dissimilarity indexes. We do all this kind of funky math to figure out to what extent are people living together or living apart. We're always asking, have we desegregated or have we not? And supposed to asking like, maybe segregation has changed. Maybe what it means to live in a segregated region isn't what it meant before. It's still segregation, but it's a different kind of change. It's a qualitative change, not a quantitative change entirely. And this is the thing that I think that we need to think about. Again, the geography of race and class is not the same that it once was, but it's not equal. And some of that has to do with, again, new things and realizing that segregation and integration are not opposites, that we can have a region that is both integrated and segregated at the same time. Okay? So that's the story of resegregation. And that's the part I want to present first, because in some ways, for people in Southern California, this is the more important kind of truth that I want to bring, because a lot of stories in the book are about how the Bay Area continued to produce that. I'm going to explain a little bit about some of those dilemmas. I'm curious to see whether they have any political relevance here, but I'm going to just pause for a second and for a while, and we can see if anybody's got any questions about this.
Oh, 1 second. So when you speak, just use the mic.
If you're aware, what are the... I'm Brian.
Hi, Brian.
If you're aware, what are the mechanisms that prevent public services from improving in areas like Oakland as the area gentrifies?
Okay. So that's a good question. A lot of it has to do, there's a variety of mechanisms that go in there. So sometimes it has to do with the fact that, again, gentrifiers tend to, especially in places like Oakland, tend to be younger, or they're so wealthy that their kids are not in public schools, and so there's a lack of advocacy for the same types of public services that other folks have. Some of it has to do with the fact that, again, one of the things that's produced this is that the fiscal structure, the way that we allocate money, tax dollars from state and federal sources and local sources to municipalities or to school districts to do things has taken a nosedive over the last 40 years. We spent a lot of time building prisons in the Central Valley to house, again, there's another corollary to this type of segregation is that a lot of, so many men, especially young men of color, have been moved out of some of the older neighborhoods, not into suburbia, but into prison. So we spent a lot of our money on that. But yeah, the sort of the fiscal deal, the deal that basically allows us to produce most of the public stuff that we've made has changed dramatically since the 1970s. And so cities like Oakland have always struggled to keep up. They struggled to keep up then when they were majority non-white. And even as they've become majority white, it hasn't, again, that's politics in Sacramento haven't changed. Politics in Oakland have changed a little bit, but not enough. And again, a lot of the focus is, sometimes it's on, again, the kind of the politics of gentrification, doing things that make the city sort of aesthetically nicer. So some of the public spaces are nicer. Right now we're spending a lot of time trying to focus on building sports stadiums. But you're not necessarily being able to invest in the public school system, in the transport system, and things of that nature. So it's a bit of a bit of a cop-out answer, but that's part of the story.
Another question? Okay, 1 second.
Hey, I'm Tristan.
Hello.
Hello. So do you think I just want your opinion, do you think the privatization of public services and basically public services is a way of segregation? Because the way I see it, it's kind of like separate but equal. Like everyone has the chance to purchase these public services, but not really because of the prices and stuff. And I don't know, I feel like that really pushes people into concentrated areas where they can afford stuff that they are offered, but it's really shit.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so this comes in a variety of ways. Again, so if you look at the history of, again, one of the things that happened that made the original post-war segregation is that we built certain suburbs very much with public monies, right? Again, 90% of the freeways were built with federal dollars, right? You had federal guaranteed mortgages that kept things affordable and kept things from, you had 30-year fixed rate mortgages with no balloon payments and no subprime lending, very little subprime lending, again, if you were white at this period of time. So one of the things that happens is that during starting in the late 1970s, beginning with Proposition 13, and then the election of Ronald Reagan and the election of George Deukmejian as the governor in the state of California in 1982, is that we slowly but surely started to kill the public sector, especially the public sector higher up. So more and more responsibility got shoved down on local jurisdictions, and local jurisdictions reacted in different ways. Wealthier places were able to sort of close up shop, right? And in many cases, what the wealthier places did is they added jobs instead of housing. Right? Because jobs generate tax revenue, jobs earn money for cities and towns, and humans, residents, cost money. When you live a place, you send your kids to school, you use the parks, you use stuff, and the amount of money because of Prop 13 that you can contribute in property taxes is not as much as it costs to house you. So places that built lots of housing suffered versus places that built lots of job space and lots of shopping centers did very well. But yeah, the wealthier places were essentially they were effectively privatizing, right? In the sense that if you close your gates and you only have a city that's only wealthy people, you're essentially, yeah, okay, it's public in the sense that anybody who lives there can use it, but it's not truly public in the sense that it's for the region. And this made it really difficult for a lot of local municipalities. Some have reacted through trying to figure out ways to make money, and so they've privatized certain functions. But in general, to me, it's not as much the act of privatization, is that it's the sort of the broader attack on the public sector that made it so that this has happened and the way that cities reacted to it. I mean, essentially, again, one of the things, think about it, another reason why you have to talk about race is that we had this really robust public sector that built universities, highways, built the stuff that allows us to live in California when California was a majority white place. And now all of a sudden it becomes a majority non-white place, and now, oh no, actually now we don't got any money. I'm sorry, the public sector's not there for you. We need to privatize. We need to do all these other things to figure it out. As if the state of California somehow got poorer during this period of time, but we did not get poorer. The state of California, our GDP is is always between 8th and 9th in the world. We're somewhere between how the French and the Italians are doing. That's about where our GDP is. We are still one of the wealthiest places in the world. We have been since the 1970s. Nothing has changed. We are just as rich. It's just that as the California populace no longer looked like it did, the voters of the state of California and the companies of the state of California used the ballot process and the political process to strip money out of the public sector and make it so that when this more diverse generation of Californians was ready to buy a house in suburbia, all that support wasn't there. And the private sector sees itself as stepping in to fill a void, but one of the things is the private sector pushed a lot of these reforms because it was a ways of making money, right? The developer, whether it's developers, whether it's banks, there was a way. People need homes. They need freeways. So if the state's not going to build it, other people are going to find ways to fill that void, right? And that's what's happened. And so again, yeah, things like Uber, or some of the rideshare operations, or if anybody follows any of the private Google buses that we have, essentially all of these, it's not that necessarily that the privatization is that the system was already unequal to begin with, and all this fancy private wealth, I don't know if it's necessarily making the situation worse, but it's certainly not making the situation any better. I mean, imagine if Google spent its millions and millions of dollars on actually improving the public transportation in Northern California, as opposed to running a fleet of private buses, which is what it does. It's more that the wealthy during this period of time have slowly seceded from the rest of us, right? Do it their own way and let those of us get on with with how we are.
Hi, my name is Andy.
Hello, Andy.
So you mentioned that you also did some work in San Bernardino.
Well, I mean, I've spent time in San Bernardino because I knew it was a place that was similar to some of the places. So I don't know if you call that work. I call it like driving around, taking pictures, trying to figure out what's going on. I don't know if you call it work. It's
so
fun.
how would you compare what you saw in San Bernardino to in the Bay Area?
So again, it's hard. I mean, I don't know San Bernardino that well. You know, I kind of like read about it and, you know, read other scholars' work, and I've spent some time driving around. Again, I think they're similar, so I don't know what it's like, again, to live there. And one of the things that's really important about what's going on and how you think about segregation and resegregation is that a lot of the places that are now part of this kind of new map of inequality, I think are really nice places. And we have a tendency, you know, we did this in the post-war era. We saw inequality emerging in places like West Oakland, and we started labeling it a ghetto or a slum, or we did all this kind of stuff. So if you want to read it, I've written a piece a few years ago about the emergence of all this kind of slumburbia talk and all this crap. Like you would see in the press after foreclosure, like all of a sudden there's poverty in suburbia, or there's like, oh, it's all a ghetto. And there was one piece about Hemet. I don't know if anybody knows Hemet, but like all of a sudden everybody's like, you know, yeah, there's abandonment, there's half-built subdivisions, there's a lot of foreclosures, and now everybody's calling it a shithole or whatever. Pardon my French. You know, and so this is one of the biggest challenges, is that a lot of these places are really nice. Yeah, they don't have, you know, they're like too far away from the jobs. They're not getting the right deal. Prop 13 makes it really difficult to create things equally. They're not getting the state funding for what they need. They don't have adequate public transportation, et cetera. Long term, yeah, is it a little bit, am I nervous about the long term? But the places are nice. And this is the thing that is most important, is that like, the answer in some ways is to go forward. I'm doing a thing tomorrow morning with all of these folks, because now in the Bay Area, because all of a sudden now everybody's concerned about, finally the foundations and like Oakland, San Francisco activists have finally realized that all these people have moved out there. Like they don't go there, they've never been there, they know it's there, they maybe see it on the end of the BART line. It's like says Antioch now, finally, because BART arrived in Antioch in 2018. It was supposed to arrive in like 1982. So finally, like now people are seeing it, and the biggest thing is to be like, okay, like these places are incomplete, is the way I like to explain it. They're incomplete. They need, but the answer is forward. Like we built this mad, crazy metropolis. Like we live in this crazy territory that is absolutely massive. I mean, this is like 12,000 square miles or something like that. It's the size of Fiji. I mean, you guys, it's like even bigger and more people. It's like a small nation, right? And so the answer in some ways is like, Antioch is nice. It's hella nice, as we say in Northern California. So I think this is one of the things is that how is it that you stay kind of positive and realize, okay, like, I get it, it's nice. I mean, people got big houses, like people went out for a swimming pool, it's warm, the weather's a lot better, it's quiet. When you talk to a lot of folks who moved out there, like, why do you move out there? Because it's quiet, it's nice. So the question has to become, how do you make it so that it is not structural and unequal, as opposed to imagining, one of the problems right now is that a lot of policymakers are imagining that somehow we're gonna like rezone around transport in the core of the Bay Area and build all these new condos, that somehow all of these people are gonna like come back home to the new condo on the BART station when the BART doesn't have any capacity and there's not exactly like millions and millions of dollars in affordable housing subsidies coming in for any of this stuff. Like, that ain't happening. This is the region that we built. And this is the region we have to live in. And so the question is, what are we going to do out here to make it more sustainable? And one of the things I like about being in Southern California is I feel like at least some of the projects about kind of maybe, you know, at least recognizing, y'all are better at recognizing what you have done and what you have made than we are in the North. In the North, like, too many of the people in positions of power have never left like a really small geography. And I think in LA, in Southern California, there's at least a little bit more of a recognition of what's out there and that the world that y'all have made. And I feel like some of the solutions, you've got a little bit better kind of regional planning, regional coordination. Again, these are not in the region. None of these places out here are part of any of the regional governance. For those of you who know your regional governance structures, like, you have a council of governance and a metropolitan planning organization that does transportation funding. Well, San Bernardino and Riverside County are part of that in Southern California. San Joaquin and Stanislaus each have their own metropolitan planning organization, separate from each other and separate from the Bay. And so we're just a lot more structurally kind of enabled, and the kind of ghettoization of the mind of a lot of people in here is much deeper, even than folks on the west side of Los Angeles, like Alvaro. You know? Because at least Alvaro gets in his car and drives out here. He knows, but because he has to learn. He spent time on the 10 going the other way. But that's the big problem, is that, again, a lot of these places are really nice. People, you know, for a lot of places, it is better, you know, like, is it better than Ramona Gardens back in the day, right? Maybe it is, but it should have been a lot better than that. It should have been a true solution to the problems of before, and it wasn't. And again, now people are just struggling to keep hold of houses, struggling to pay gas bills, struggling to deal with that commute, struggling to deal, you know, how do you raise kids when you got to leave at 5 o'clock in the morning and, you know, and then you get home at 8 o'clock at night because you have to drive too far? These are the structural problems, but the problem is not out here. And so this is, maybe as a segue, this is one of the things that I want folks to think about, right? So this is Antioch, one of the places I spent a lot of time in. Again, Antioch made the front cover of the New York Times twice in 2008, 2009. One because of foreclosures and one because of issues around conflicts over race and Section 8 vouchers. So one of the biggest problems that we do is that, again, when all this went down, all the reporters came out to Hemet or go to Lancaster or Palmdale or wherever and like point out these places and be like, oh, okay, here's the problem. This is where the problem's at. But Antioch is not the problem. I mean, Antioch is a place that has problems, but the problem is just as much Marin County, where I grew up in the North Bay, as Antioch. And so this is, I think, one of the key things is that, again, it's not like the problems in San Bernardino or in Fontana or in, you name it, are right? It's not these places on their own that created the problems that they have to deal with. These are much bigger problems that were created by other places, by more exclusive places in the region, right? So, and this is one of the things that's particularly important to understand. And so what are some of the things that happen? And so, like, again, this is the question that dominates the book. And if is anybody from Northern California in the room? Where are you from? Oh, well, we'll have to talk about that afterwards. One of my favorite places. A complicated place, a very big place that, like, right? A very, very big place that, like, stretches all into all kinds of interesting corners, right? And a very diverse place. So, right, we know that the problem, you know, Richmond is a place that has problems inside of it, but not entirely produced by Richmond. Now, the Richmond government and its relationship to Chevron produced plenty of its own problems, right? Nobody is blameless in this. And some of the cities and communities out in deep Riverside and San Bernardino County or Northern LA County or out here in Eastern LA County or even parts of Orange County, they're definitely, local leaders were part of the problem, right? The relationship with developers, they cut deals to be able to build things as cheaply as possible without necessarily the type of public services or without a good financing structure or a fiscal structure in place to make sure that you could keep the roads paved and that you could keep the lights on and you could keep the schools open, right? So there's a lot of mistakes that were made in a lot of places. But I want to point to a couple of key things. So what I like to talk about in the book is what I think about as the idea of effective politics. And so one of the things that we need to think about is, again, Northern California, on the first Tuesday in November, almost everybody votes for the same party. We don't have a lot of divisions when it comes to certain types of politics, like war. For the most part, we agree. Even like the politics of hate, for the most part, most people in the Bay Area would be like, you know, I'm against hate, I'm against, you know, against racism, I'm against homophobia, you name it, right? We're not divided in those kinds of ways. But when it comes to like space and place and race, when it comes to who gets to live next to who and how do you build what kind of housing and how do you build what kind of transportation systems, the stuff that involves like actually building everything that you see, then all of a sudden we fragment. And so one of the things I think we need to do is to start separating in our minds different kinds of politics. So if you and I have a conversation about abortion, our job is not to like figure out a compromise. Like you might think one thing and I think another thing, and there's a line, might be a line thicker than that cable right there. And that's just the way it's going to be. No amount of like arguing is probably going to change it. But I'm assuming that we both agree that housing is necessary. I'm assuming that we both agree that people need to move around. Like there needs to be transportation, and that, like, you know, even though you might work really hard and be a strong individual, like, you're not going to build your own transportation system. You didn't build your own car. You didn't build the roads the car rode on. You didn't build your own bus. You didn't build your own train. So the politics of urbanization are different. We all agree that the system has to work. We just fight about how or where or for whom. But we all agree that it has to work. And I think we need to start having a different set of standards for the politics of housing and water and food, healthcare, education, the things that we all agree that have to happen, and we all agree that we probably can't all build them ourselves. Nobody, you know, Ayn Rand, no matter how libertarian you are, Ayn Rand didn't build her own house. And even the most libertarian person you meet won't be like, yeah, I believe everybody should mill their own lumber, build their own house, dig all the ore for the, you know, smelt it, build those pipes, pumped into a water system that you build yourself. I mean, come on, that's crazy talk. You look at me like, you smoking a little too much of that post-legalization kind of stuff. No, like, you got to have a system. Build house builders and where materials come from, and some of that might be private, some of that may be public, but who cares? Like, do you really care? You just want, at the end of the day, people just want that house. They want to be able to get to the schools. They want to be able to get to work. They want to be able to get to the store, whatever. And that's where we fell apart in the Bay. Is that, like, we might all agree on war, or we might all agree on hate, or we might all agree even on abortion or things like that, or at least the majority of us. But when it came down to, like, channeling that political unity into a new politics of housing or transport, that's where it all fragmented. And so more attention needs to be paid to this other kind of politics. To me, these are the really important kinds. I mean, this is the stuff that we actually have to agree on. And so let me give you just briefly a couple quick examples of how this politics became kind of dysfunctional, like how we were not able to come together into what I like to think of as common purpose, right? Like, what is the purpose of politics? To me, it's about agreeing on how to build all the stuff around us. So one of the things that we had a lot of in Northern California is what I like to call the Dougherty Valley Dilemma. So this is a picture of Dougherty Valley. It's a sort of suburb in, it's southern Contra Costa County, same county. Outside of the city of San Ramon. It's a sort of in the middle of, if you remember the maps where there was like Oakland and Richmond on this side and then the far suburbs where people moved, and I mentioned there was a big zone in here where that remained pretty white, that's where this is. And there was a big proposal for a massive set of subdivisions, a massive amount of housing. Mostly kind of stuff that looks like, you can see, if it looks, it was designed to look like Southern California, so it kind of looks like here. Every time I'm here, I think I'm in this part of Southern California. So this became a site where developers and environmentalists fought for about a decade, spent millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to fight each other over what's going to happen in the valley, right? Environmentalists didn't want things to happen in the valley, or maybe they would have been okay with a few homes. Developers wanted lots of homes, but not like apartment buildings with transport and trains and buses, like more suburbia. And they spent millions and millions of dollars, and again, in a decade, it sucked up tons of the court's time and the press and all of this kind of political energy. But you know what? No matter what had happened here, that wasn't going to actually solve any of the problems of segregation. That wasn't going to solve the environmental unsustainability of the region. That wasn't going to make anybody's commutes better. It wasn't going to do anything. And in the Bay Area, we had lots of these fights between essentially white middle-class environmentalists and white upper-class developers, or sometimes white upper-class environmentalists and white middle-class developers. They were kind of like maybe some slight class variation, but generally pretty white, where they spent millions of dollars and tons of time and sucked up all this political energy and all this political space, and no matter who won, the majority of us lost. And this became a huge part of the politics of Northern California. These crazy-ass, long, deep, bloody fights where, like, in the end, nothing was going to change. Dougherty Valley was never going to become a solution to the problem. It was never going to provide opportunity for people living in Richmond to have a bit of, to have a slice of the American dream and a bit of opportunity. It was never going to expand our transit map and solve some of the fiscal problems so that the tax dollars, we were pulling out enough tax dollars and putting them back into the system so that we weren't having questions of privatization and we weren't creating more and more exclusion, right? In the end, after all this, they built a little bit of they built more of a suburb. You can see they do little kind of token racial capitalism type things. So for instance, you might notice that those are blossoming cherry trees, which they were planted on purpose to appeal to Asian American homeowners. Little things like that where they tried to play little like tokenistic games of inclusion, but in a way that just kind of ultimately ends up just reproducing the problems in the metropolis. And we had just a ton of this. So there's so much money and so much political energy in the Bay Area, but it just got channeled into kind of dead ends like this. There's what I like to talk about as the gentrification dilemma. And so for a lot of communities of color during this time, you were faced with a series of choices which, again, were just not really a choice at all. And this is the big thing. Right? You can either stay and fight for old neighborhoods that were either rapidly changing, right? So the change that was offered to you if you were in West Oakland was change that was largely going to displace. It wasn't designed for you. It wasn't meant to house you better or house you in a more healthy way. It wasn't designed to make life better. It was like, here's all this investment. Sorry if it displaces you. It's not really for you, but your other choice is to continue to be abandoned, to continue to be underinvested. Oftentimes you got both, right? You get certain types of investment, right? New investment in all kinds of fixing up all the houses, but so that they can evict people and rent them or sell them at higher rates without necessarily, again, fixing the streets or fixing the schools or fixing the transportation system or making things better. And what this gentrification dilemma also did is that, again, many of the communities' colors in the core of the Bay Area had limited resources with which to play the political game. And many chose to stay and fight in the communities in which they had come from, right? Black churches in particular stayed, right? People stayed in the neighborhoods, even as the communities had gone, right? But there wasn't enough political energy for obvious reasons, right? Especially considering that so many of these people are spending so much time in the car commuting, to be able to really invest political energy in these new places and in these new communities, and especially at the level of like this obscure level of regional and state politics where the funding allocations are made around transport. And so it just became a situation where, again, communities in gentrifying spaces in the core, in some of those old segregated neighborhoods, had a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, right? There wasn't a lot of, it was seemed to be being offered a choice, but it wasn't a real choice. It was never a real choice. So people will come out to you and say like, oh, this is just the market, man. This is like, people just made a choice. Nah. Okay, yeah, they chose. It's like your choice is the frying pan or the fryer. That's not a choice. The choice is like a nice bed of kale where you're sitting there like, getting sun. That's a choice. But this is not a real choice. And this is one of the things, again, I talk about a lot in the book, is all of these sort of false choices where people weren't really given a choice. It wasn't really a choice, right? So the big politics of regional government that were trying to sort of change the way we were sprawling into Never Never Land and people are having, constant affordable housing crisis, these spaces of politics were never truly open to communities of color, partly, again, because they were having to spend too much time fighting just to sort of stay alive and not be evicted from the spaces where they had come from. And finally, one of the big tragedies is that I'm a planner like Alvaro. Before I became an exile in British geography, I was a California planner. Maybe someday California planning will let me back in. I hope so. Hint, hint, Is that one of the things that happened is that making things nicer, like doing planning right, became a strategy, either a strategy for exclusion or just an automatic kind of byproduct of exclusion. So if you go to chapter 6 of the book, if you look at some of the Central Valley cities, the cities that basically did planning right, like forced developers to build better quality buildings, to build sidewalks, to allocate money for street lamps and do all this kind of public infrastructure stuff so that the city didn't have to do it, they stayed whiter and more exclusive. The cities that opened their doors but with lower standards suffered the consequences, and so did the people. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in terms of building any sort of political faith, is that if you're in a low-income community anywhere in the state of California and you see something new coming in, I mean, chances are you know it's not for you. Most new stuff is a threat. And you're probably right. I mean, because it isn't designed for you, and that's what's really tragic. All right? I spent the last bunch of years living in France, and I live in an old neighborhood. There was an old industrial neighborhood, right, where there's a new plan to build like 15,000 people. You know, there's all these crazy new buildings being built. But they built the tramway 3 years before anybody moved in. And so as I live in the old neighborhood, and as it's an old working class neighborhood where people felt like this tram is not designed to displace me. Yeah, okay, we know it's only coming out to us because it needs to serve the new residents, but like, it's also designed to serve us, and guess what? It served us 3 years before, right? Those houses were built with 25% affordability guaranteed. Nobody had to occupy anything or chain themselves or protest in the street to demand affordable housing because it was done like, of course, duh. And so there's this way, like, it's been crazy to be in a place like France where new things happen and people don't feel threatened because they know, in fact, they're not being threatened, where people actually feel like, okay, maybe some of this stuff is for us. I live in a neighborhood in Bordeaux in France, where I used to, before my wife moved us out, where there are more black residents now because of the new development than before. Find me a place that has become more black or more Latino because of all the fancy new buildings than it was before. It's like, in America right now, you'd be like, what? So this is one of the challenges, right? And this is how do you, again, in order, all of this was done because of politics, not because of policy. And how do you sort of think about, like, what would it take to restore faith so that when you see nice new stuff, you feel like maybe it's for you? I mean, this is actually one of the only things that maybe, because actually I see nice new stuff being built there and it actually is for you guys, but that's because we're on this, like, special campus. Or maybe you don't think that. I don't know. Are those dorms for y'all? You gotta tell me no. See, I'm already getting like no. I don't know about that shiny new. What about the shiny new spaceship behind us? All right, this we'll have a discussion afterwards. But this is again one of the challenges, right? As planners, it's almost impossible to plan to design anything new. And again, all throughout the Bay Area, there's so many of these types of dilemmas, like out of the frying pan into the fire, where the politics was just never able to come down. We knew in the Bay Area since the time that I was born that this process was happening. People saw it happening. We wrote tons of plans. We made tons more plans and more plans, lots of reports. And at the end of the day, the politics side never came together. That Obama coalition that we've had forever never happened. White environmentalists, white middle-class environmentalists never stepped up for communities of color in a way that they needed to. And that's true locally, that's true regionally, and that's true at this level of the state of California. All right? For those of you who know a little bit about or are interested in California politics, that's what Chapter 8 is about. I'm happy to send the chapter to you, or the whole, actually, there's a special student discount. I'll send you the proof for free if you want to read it. Right? That's essentially the story, right? All throughout, we had lots of chances to really turn the ship around, but nobody was really to make that kind of sacrifices. And white middle, in particular, a lot of the blame is this kind of white middle-class environmental politics, right? Never willing to sort of step up and make the changes that were necessary. Gentleman in the back. The mic is coming.
Hold on 1 second.
Hello, I'm Dennis Lopez in Ethnic and Women's Studies. And,
Thank you for coming.
A couple things. One, Gary Orfield talks about not only desegregation, which he started in his career, to resegregation, and then hypersegregation in the context of education.
Yeah.
And how it differs because segregation by race is pretty well known, and the correlation with income is pretty well known. But now there's concentrations in those schools of English language learners, so it's more complex. Secondly, you talked about the politics. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, 28 years old, Democratic socialist, talks about how if we change the tax rate for people $10 million a year and above to 70%, which is a lot less than when Eisenhower built the freeways in the 50s. It was 90%. We have more of those millionaires now. So if we change for the $10 million and $1 to raise that tax rate to 70%, that would generate a lot of revenue. And we could afford a lot of those things that we can't afford now. So another thing that people talk about is not only the homelessness and there's a word for poverty, not deep poverty. You probably know the word, but there's a severe, something like it's an adjective explaining not just regular poverty, but this deep generational poverty has expanded. Homelessness has expanded, and yet Gil Garcetti and the LA Council says every council district has to have address the homeless issue in a tangible way with numbers of providing housing for numbers of people. And I guess lastly, because this is a theme that I think came up in your talk, Thomas Frank, what's wrong with Kansas? Mm-hmm. Well, that premise was about the white middle class and voting against their economic self-interest. But I think what Ocasio-Cortez and the other newly elected, or many of the other newly elected members of Congress bring, if not democratic socialism, they bring a critique, perhaps, of the new Democrat Bill Clinton type of, we will snuggle up with Wall Street and we will adopt Republican priorities as Democrats, the new Democrat of the Clinton era, the Bill Clinton era. So I guess what I'm saying is some of the possibilities are, if we look at Proposition 13 and the extent to which corporate interests get more than individual families, or if we look at the tax rate as Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders would suggest, and maybe Elizabeth Warren, yeah, and we could run campaigns like Bernie Sanders and now Kamala Harris, where the average contribution is $39 or less. So anyways, I think all those factors play into the new possibilities.
So
you have about 2 minutes.
I appreciate all those comments, and let me just say a few things. So yeah, I dream of sort of sending AOC my, and I'm going to call her that because it sounds like RFK to me, and she feels like, I don't know what it was like with RFK, but I feel like that's kind of the same vibe, maybe. I don't know. We're not that old, but I agree. I'm excited, you know. So the key thing for me is, if you're thinking about, one of the things though that I try to do in the book, and I think is really important to try to communicate to her, and and to various other people, is we have to start, it's not enough to, one of the problems is that it's still stuck, some of the language is still stuck in the 20th century. So I love the idea of the Green New Deal, and I love the idea of tax rate, but this becomes like on an old-fashioned capital labor, all kinds of things, where in terms of actual day-to-day lives, it's not going to fix some of the problems. So the Green New Deal has to be a new fiscal deal. So it's not good enough. So if we're going to raise all this money from the rich people, great, but how are we going to spend it? Our spending system is just as broken as our raising system, and in fact, it's actually more broken. So one of the problems is that big cities like LA have absorbed sort of all the limelight. The city of San Francisco is like 1 in 10 residents of the entire Bay Area that I'm talking about. Even if you add San Jose, Oakland, and San Francisco, that's like 25% of the region. Most of us live in these small random cities that we don't know much about, and we don't change these. We haven't changed a county boundary in California since 1905. In France and Germany and the UK and other places where they have the same quality of resources, when the political jurisdictions don't work to be able to spend the money. It's not about raising the money. It's easy to raise the money. It's how do you spend it correctly? They change the boundaries. They change and people are willing, okay, yeah, we'll fuse our town with that town. We'll start sharing police services. We'll start sharing maintenance. Our problem is that we're not good at spending the money. It's not just that we're not good at raising the money, so we're not good at spending it. And so the Green New Deal has to be a new fiscal deal. It has to be able to solve the Prop 13 problems around how we raise money in that way, but also all the constitutional problems with how we spend money. We also got to be able to solve problems like the Costa-Hawkins Act, right? So one of the things I'm focusing a lot now is a housing policy that protects the vulnerable and not just about producing new houses. Because again, most people in California have a home, but what they're afraid of is they're seeing all of the rise in homelessness. And one of the, I think, the weaknesses of my book and the weaknesses of talking about segregation the way I do is that it doesn't actually account for all of those people which are increasingly housed nowhere or housed under an overpass or housed in a cardboard box. And that's becoming a big problem. And so I need to account for that more, but it has to be about how we spend the money. It has to be a Green New Fiscal Deal that creates some sanity about how the money is actually spent on public services. And again, it has to address our infrastructure problem, and it can't do it in the way that he who shall not be named in the White House wants to do it, which is entirely, when you elect a landlord in chief, you're going to get landlordist type of ideas about how to raise money for infrastructure, which is privatize, privatize, privatize. So it can't. We've got to start talking about how we spend it, and that's difficult politically because then it becomes tax and spend liberals and all of this kind of 20th century conversations. But that's what it's going to take to be able to kind of get us. We have the money, we just don't spend it very well. And I think we can spend it in different ways. And it has to be invested in these places. I love LA, I love San Francisco, but the majority of us don't live in those cities anymore. We live elsewhere. We live in other places. And our cities don't get enough attention. We don't spend enough time thinking about how to spend money. And South El Monte, what did I go through today? El Monte, somehow they're separate cities for some reason. Well, the future of California is in the El Montes and the Hemets and all of these kinds of places, and not just in the City of Angels.
All right, round of applause, people. Sometimes with all my education, I feel like those memory sticks, like it's a full capacity, like I can't download any more files. But today I feel like it kind of expanded and I actually learned something. So this is a really deep talk. It's a lot of information. It's something that is going to be on, we're going to have it on YouTube. So every time you click, I get $1, so make sure you click more than once. I want to thank Dr. Shafran for coming and speaking to us. He comes from a long, long distance to be here. And also encourage you to check out his webpage. He has photographs and articles and other things. And actually, that's, I guess the congressman is calling me right now, the AOC or whatever her name is. So I encourage everybody to buy the book. I think it's only like $24.99 or something like that.
I mean, I encourage anybody who's a professor to buy the book, and I encourage the students to email me and ask for a PDF. That's
the
what
black
I would
market?
say. Black market book directly from me. Don't tell my publisher.
Actually, I have a few copies in the trunk, so if you want to follow me, I take food stamps and all that. I'm going to assign it to my class. Well, let's just say that we want people like Shafran and others to talk about these issues and to use whatever privilege that he has for the public good. All of you are university students or you're affiliated with the university. So this is the message that I have for you, is that use whatever education you get, especially if you're taking my class, because you'll learn something. I don't know about the other classes, but at least mine. But use your education for the public good so that we can live in a better world. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.